Good morning and good afternoon to everyone who has joined us to this webinar on academic publishing. We are very happy that we have audience from almost 50 different countries joining in today. I'm Nishan Sandile. I am the regional representative for EURAXESS Australia and New Zealand. I'm delighted to welcome today all the way from Sweden, Victoria Babbit, who is the Director of Research, Development and Outreach at Taylor & Francis. Before we move on any further, just to give you a very brief background about EURAXESS, it's an initiative of the European Commission that addresses barriers to mobility of researchers. The idea is to provide you free information about European research, career opportunities, and international collaboration possibilities. Of course, you might have already learned about EURAXESS in the past webinars, hence I'll not move on any further on EURAXESS. What we'll do is, just to give you a running order of today's webinar, we'll pass it on to Victoria. We'll present on academic publishing. We'll let you all just type in the chat functionality any questions that you have during her presentation so that we can come back later and revisit any questions that you might have. So I'd encourage you to chat on the chat functionality. Before we move on to her presentation, just a small exercise that I'd like to do is a poll will appear on your screen. You might have received a prompt, and I request everyone to just start putting in your response. The idea is to understand what is your highest qualification. It's just to understand what is the demographic of our attendees. I can see that around 53% have already voted. I'll still give you some time, maybe 5 more seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. I'll close the poll right now. We have a very good mix. 48% is masters, 48% is PhD, and 4% is postdoc. So I believe that will give you a more or less idea of how the audience are stacked, Victoria, so that you could try to keep that in your consideration when you are presenting. Without further ado, what I'll do is I'll pass on the presenter rights to you, Victoria, so that you could start your presentation.
Many thanks for the introduction, Nishant, and welcome to all of you who have joined the webinar this afternoon. In this session, we will explore different elements of publishing with a particular focus on open access. Let's begin with looking at the publishing landscape today. There are approximately 10,000 publishers today, with around 5,000 indexed in Scopus. And those publishers are publishing around 33,000 active English language peer-reviewed journals, with a further 9,000, 9,500 non-English language peer-reviewed journals. And this number traditionally grows by about 3.5% year on year. These journals are publishing over 3 million articles per year. Again, this number traditionally grows year on year by about 3%. However, the growth rates have accelerated in recent years to 5% and 4% respectively, in part due to the rise of open access, but more likely due to the increase in research and development spend by nations across the world. And this investment supports the work of between 7 to 8 million researchers, depending on definition. Interestingly, only about 20% are repeat authors. So as you can see, this is a very active landscape, and it is important to think through your research and publishing strategies if you would like to make an impact. Here we have a snapshot of the publishing process. We will discuss each of these stages today. But what I'd like to point out here are the different versions of the article. It's important to understand the significance of each of these versions, especially if you're not planning on publishing in an open access journal. The first version is called the author's original manuscript, or the author's version. Increasingly, though, it's called the preprint. This is a version you submit for peer review, and authors may post this version anywhere they would like. The next version is called the accepted manuscript or the postprint. This version has gone through the peer review process and has been accepted. However, it has not been copy edited or typeset. Authors are able to post this version immediately on their personal website or share it via Facebook or LinkedIn. If the article has been published in a subscription-based journal, authors must wait until after an embargo period to archive the article in a repository. If the journal that the author is published in is an open access journal, authors may post this version immediately to a repository. Lastly, we have the version of record. This is the final published version of an article. This version is maintained by the publisher and updated with relevant information. And this version may not be posted online unless you've published in an open access journal. Before you begin investigating possible journal options, it's essential that you spend time understanding your project and the audience you would like to reach. Throughout your career, you will likely be involved in many types of research, producing a variety of content. Typically, people focus on the research article, but you may publish review articles, whether that's a literature or theory review or a systematic review, position pieces, case studies, book reviews, the list goes on and on. Sometimes your work will be written for specialists in your field, but you may also choose to engage in public scholarship, writing for the general public, or engaging in policy, developing policy, writing white papers. So take the time to determine your objectives. And when you begin investigating the appropriate place to publish, remember you are joining an ongoing conversation in your field. Make sure that you are contributing thoughtfully to that conversation. Your contribution should be novel, and it should be pushing the discussion forward in some way. There are many different elements to take into consideration when choosing a journal, and I've listed a few here. First of all, we have age. Obviously, a well-established journal with a good reputation is a safe bet. However, that doesn't mean you should ignore new or recently established journals. They may be publishing cutting-edge research or working with a new publication model that is interesting to you. Just make sure that you do your research on the journal before submitting. It can be helpful to look at the history of the journal. Has it published key researchers in the field? Does it publish on time? Do they have a history of retractions or other problems? Affiliation may be important. Is the journal of an important society or institution? Is it published by a trusted publishing house? Scope will definitely be of interest depending on the project you're working on. Is the journal interdisciplinary? Is it a niche journal? Is it covering broad subject matter? Is it a mega journal? All of this will be outlined in the aims and scope statement on the journal website. I mentioned thinking about who your audience is. It's important to think about who reads the journal. Is the journal geared towards practitioners? Is it a global audience? Is it a very, again, niche journal that's focusing on a particular geographical region? Impact can be measured in a number of ways. Obviously, the impact factor has great importance right now, is used as a metric for quality in many instances. However, there might be other metrics that are important to you and to your community. The journal itself might be a very important journal for your community. It might be a source of teaching. Just make sure to understand what is valued in your institution and field in terms of impact. Editorial board will give you an indication of what type of research the journal is interested in receiving. Boards are built to reflect the ambitions of a journal. So they try and bring on board people who are working in specific fields where they would like to see more research, or perhaps people based in different geographical regions where they would like to draw in more authors. So do take a look at the board to see who is on it. You might even find some of the people that you really, really admire in terms of their work. Publishing model is becoming increasingly important, and we're going to be discussing OA in just a moment, so I'll leave that here. And peer review style may be important to you. This information will always be included in the instructions for authors. And lastly, many journals post their rejection rate on the website. This will give you an indication of the competition level of the journal. But even if they don't publish the rejection rate, if you're looking at some of these other characteristics, other qualities to a journal, you'll probably get a good sense of how competitive a journal is. So all or some of these characteristics may be important to you when choosing a journal. It just, again, depends on the particular project you're working on at the time. So I've mentioned open access a couple of times. Many, if not most of you, will be aware of open access and open research more broadly. So what are the benefits of publishing in an open access journal or platform? The main benefits are greater visibility, and with that, potentially greater impact, both within the research community and the broader public. And the access, visibility, and impact can spur innovation. At Taylor & Francis, we have seen that open access articles typically receive substantially more citations. So we see about a 32% increase, and greater readership with over 6 times as many downloads. Increasingly, in many countries, regions, and institutions, open access has become a requirement or strongly encouraged. But let's just take a step back and look at what open access actually entails. There are 2 basic elements to open access: making content freely available online and making content reusable by a third party. I'll briefly discuss both of these elements. There are many terms thrown around when talking about open access. So you have gold open access and green open access, bronze open access, diamond open access. The list goes on and on. Seems like there's a new term a day. Today, I will just focus on gold open access. Gold open access essentially entails making the PDF, the final version of record, freely available online. There are 2 ways in which an author can publish open access with Taylor & Francis, either in a fully open access journal or in what we call a hybrid journal. Fully open access journals publish all of their content in an open access format. And these journals are not funded by subscriptions. So instead, most charge what's called an APC, or an article publishing charge. However, many journals are funded by societies or institutions. In this case, either the author does not have to pay any kind of APC, or they may pay a reduced fee. All of this information should be clearly presented on the journal website under the instructions for authors. Often, your funder or institution will also cover the charge. For Taylor & Francis fully open access journals, we also have different agreements due to geographical regions based on the World Bank designation. So for higher income countries down to lower income countries, there will be some sort of a discount that is available to authors depending on where they're located. Hybrid open access is when an author chooses to publish open access in a journal that is subscription funded, and much of their content is not freely accessible unless you or your institution has a subscription. These journals charge an APC to cover the publication costs for the particular open access articles that come through. However, many institutions and consortia have agreements with publishers to cover the APC costs for the hybrid journals. So just take the time to look at the journal you're publishing with and have an understanding of what kind of discounts your university may have as well. The second element of open access is how your work can be used after publication by others. If you publish OA, you will be asked to choose a Creative Commons license, which describes how people can use your work in the future. Some journals do not give you a choice on which type of license you can use, so it's important that you investigate prior to submission if you have any concerns. Here are the licenses. First, we have CC BY, and this license allows authors to use your work in any way they choose, as long as they clearly attribute authorship and the original publication. And this tends to be the default license for pure open access journals. CC BY and C is where an author can use your work in any manner, but they cannot profit from it. So the NC stands for non-commercial. For instance, they can't include your article in a book that they will turn around and charge money for. CC, BY, and D. Here the author cannot change your work in any way. They must use it in the original form. For instance, this would mean that they couldn't translate your work. Lastly, we have CC, BY, SA. And this means that when people use your work, they need to attach the same license as you did originally. This is also important to be aware of when you're using other people's work that's been published in an open access format. With the rise of open access, we have seen an emergence of what are often called predatory publishers or journals. And I can imagine that some of you have been contacted by these publishers who show enthusiastic interest in your work and ask you to submit to the journal. They often state that the peer review process is unrealistically short, so they'll talk about days rather than weeks. And the websites might feature information that's incorrect or misleading, such as stating that they have a global impact factor. Just be aware, impact factors are called just that, never anything else. They also oftentimes will take a very well-known journal and slightly change the name, so you think that you're submitting to a journal that is well established, but in fact it's not. Here are some key characteristics of predatory journals. They often have hidden or unclear author fees. They lack quality peer review of authors by experts in the field. And they tend to guarantee acceptance and or promise a very, very fast publication time. So they talk about 1 week or 48 hours. If you want your research to be read and respected by others in your field, locally and or internationally, it's important to avoid publication in these fake journals. En masse, they erode the credibility of all the research published in them. However, there is help on hand. Here we have resources to help you make sound decisions about where you would like to publish when considering publishing in an open access journal. For instance, a key resource is Think, Check, Submit. And this is a cross-industry initiative which aims to help researchers make informed choices and to choose trusted journals to publish their research in. Think, Check, Submit can help you identify high-quality journals which would be appropriate for submitting your research. And they can protect you against fraud and publishing malpractice. However, the best approach is to seek advice from respected colleagues. The DOAJ is a database for open access journals. The journals in the database have been screened to ensure that they are legitimate. However, like many databases, there is an assessment period, so new journals that are legitimate may not be listed immediately. In those cases, you'll need to make sure that they are published by a respected publisher. And here's where OWASPA can help. OWASPA is an organization for publishers and service providers working with open access. Members need to meet certain standards to be included. So if the journal you're considering publishing in is not included in the DOAJ and their publisher is not a member of OWASPA, you should proceed with extreme caution. Now, obviously today we will not be doing a writing workshop, but I do have some simple guidance for you to consider when preparing your manuscript. First of all, think like an editor. Make it easy for them to read and enjoy your work. Depending on the size of a journal, editors can receive anywhere from 50 to well over 1,000 manuscripts a year. So make sure yours stands out. And here are some basics to help make your argument easy to read and understand. Write first and edit later. This will help you create a through line in your paper, that line that holds all the different parts together. And remember, simplicity is key, especially when you're dealing with complex problems or theories. So think about your sentence structure, the length of your sentences, and your use of passive voice, and be very cautious when using the passive voice. The goal is to make it as easy as possible for the reader to follow and understand your arguments and evidence. The best way for achieving this, of course, is to create a clear and easy to follow structure to your paper. Irrespective of discipline, most academics papers do follow this model. It's especially important that you create a strong introduction, so 2 to 3 pages. Editors and readers often assess the relevance of a paper based on the introduction. So it should be well structured and articulate the key elements. An introduction should establish the research question or problem you're exploring, provide a clear thesis or argument, which is easy to see and understand, and make sure your argument stands out. Don't bury it in the midst of the third paragraph. And provide an outline of the structure of the paper, letting readers know exactly what they can expect. And the outline would include the methods or theory section, the results or your findings, a discussion, and finally, a conclusion. Again, different disciplines call these sections different things, but that's the basic structure there. Lastly, it's important to remember your role is that of a storyteller. It's up to you to give life to the exciting story of your research. So be brave and be bold in the telling of that story. Once you publish, you of course would like people to be able to read and find your work. This begins with the basics, the first elements of your paper that potential readers will see, the title and the abstract. Title styles and formats can vary somewhat depending on subject area and individual writing style. However, there's some tricks to keep in mind when you're composing your title. Write the title after you've written the paper. Although it's not a bad idea to jot down ideas while you're writing, especially if you really struggle with coming up with good titles. You want to keep it short and to the point, so 16 words or fewer is the basic recommendation. And include some of the essential terms in your paper, in your title. Try to avoid any jargon or abbreviations. Remember, you're very close to the research, and a lot of you might feel that everyone's going to understand these abbreviations, but perhaps people won't. And the title should be the most basic explanation of your paper. Make sure that it captures the subject of your paper and that it stands out in some way. So that can be either for its clarity or for its creativity. So why are abstracts important? Abstracts should tell the reader what the article is about. They're like mini film trailers for your paper. Should give a sense of what the story is about without providing all of the detail. So I always say they're like French film trailers instead of American film trailers, when you never have to actually go to the movie because they've told you everything that's going to happen. And here are some basic tips. Number one, it's difficult to write a decent abstract before you actually finish writing the paper, as the abstract is an overview of the content, or a map, if you will. Make sure that you know the parameters for the particular journal you're submitting to. Most will have word counts for abstracts, and some of them will have really particular guidance on the format and the structure. And you can find all that information in the instructions for authors. Think about who your potential audience is going to be and write for them. Again, if you're hoping to draw in an audience of people that are working in your particular area, you can probably use much more specific language than if you were trying to pull in a more general audience, or maybe you might use different language if you're trying to draw in practitioners. Choose the language carefully. And you want to think about keywords. Again, how someone might search for your work, and make sure that you include those in your abstract. Once you've written your abstract, and I encourage you to just do a kind of a free write, if you will, to get all the ideas down there, go through and remove any unnecessary words so that you end up by focusing only on the essential information. And if you end up revising your paper, which you will during the peer review process, after you've written the abstract, make sure to review and revise the abstract as well, so that it reflects that final version. Lastly, read your abstract out loud and have others read it for fluency. If your abstract is difficult to read, it's unlikely that people are going to click through to the article because they'll assume that the article is also going to be quite difficult to read. Along with titles and abstracts, authors are often asked to provide keywords that will be included with the metadata for their article. These act as flags and searches to help readers find your work. Make sure to identify the words or phrases that would be effective in searching for your work. And think about using synonyms, as people might use slightly different words, especially if your work is interdisciplinary. And as I've mentioned, having keywords in your title and abstract, you might think of using synonyms to the words that you used in your title and abstract, again, just to try and draw in as many authors or readers as you can. When using words and especially phrases, be specific to narrow down the search results. Think about using qualifiers with your phrases, as with the example I have on the slide here. So I've written homelessness versus Swedish homelessness policy. I'm going to get completely different results with those two searches. With the homelessness, I'm probably going to get a lot of results that are about services in the Stockholm region, etc. But if I frame it with Swedish and policy, I'm probably going to start getting white papers, government agencies, and probably some academic papers. So, I mean, the main thing here is just to really think about testing your words in Google Scholar and Google in general. What results do you get? Is it what you expected? If not, think about refining them. Okay, so before we discuss the process further, I'd like to take a moment to highlight some of the ethical issues we see on a regular basis. Issues around publishing ethics are seemingly on the rise, or it's possible that we're just getting better at identifying these breaches. And here are some of the issues that we see on a regular basis. So authorship disputes, competing interests, duplicate submission or publication, data or image fabrication or falsification, plagiarism and or text recycling, peer review manipulation, and breaches of copyright. Now, we could easily have a full session on publication ethics today, but I'm just going to focus on 3 of the most common issues we see across disciplines. So the first one is authorship issues, and then we have duplicate submission or publication, and lastly, we have plagiarism or text recycling, sometimes called salami slicing. So, authorship issues or authorship disputes are quite common, and they tend to slow down the peer review and production processes. Often the issues have to do with disagreements over who is included on the author line, the sequence of names, who is responsible for the different parts of the process. To avoid any problems, it's extremely important that you have a written agreement between all of the authors regarding responsibilities, the sequence of names on authorship line, and what journals you're going to submit to. Apart from the standard authorship disputes, here are 3 distinct issues that we see. The first one is ghost authorship. And this is when a significant contribution to a manuscript has been made without the acknowledgement of that contribution. And this can be an issue because we can't know if there's a conflict of interest if we don't know who all of the authors are. The second one is guest authorship. And this is when authorship is granted to an individual who doesn't meet the ethical standards for authorship, as I listed on this slide here. And this often occurs because they've added someone's name due to their seniority or their reputation or their supposed influence. This is common in some institutions, but anyone on the authorship line should have made a significant contribution to the paper, as they will be held responsible for it in the future. Authorship for sale is another phenomenon that we have seen that seems to be on the rise. There have been a number of cases where individuals, or especially paper mills, offered to add an author's name after a paper has been accepted for publication, but for a price. And these actors prey on the desperation of scholars who are under so much pressure to publish more and more articles to progress their careers. So who qualifies as an author? I've kind of listed 4 different elements here, but the main takeaway here is any listed author is representative of the published paper and should have in-depth knowledge about all aspects of the study as published. So that means the rationale, the methodology, the analysis, and the interpretation. So duplicate submission. This is a rule that many early career researchers are surprised by. The main point to make here is you may only submit your paper to one journal at a time. Why might it be a problem to submit to more than one journal at a time? Well, when you submit your paper to a journal for review, you are committing to publish in that journal, and they will use their time and their resources to review your paper and help you improve it. And the important takeaway here is you can only publish a paper once. There can only be one version of record. This is surprisingly easy to detect also. It's important to keep this in mind because often papers are sent to the same reviewers who then alert the editors and publishers that they're looking at the same paper for 2 different journals. And I've mentioned this earlier, this can often happen because there wasn't a clear agreement on the roles and responsibilities between co-authors. Hence, 2 of the co-authors accidentally submit the paper to 2 different journals. But I just need to flag that editors are becoming a little bit less forgiving and often will withdraw the paper in question from peer review. Now, sometimes it's okay to submit work that has been presented elsewhere. You just need to be honest with the editor about the previous presentation and/or publication or posting. Transparency is key. For instance, if you have published an article in your native language but would like to publish in another language, just contact the editor of the journal that you would like to publish with and ask them if they would be interested in publishing a translation. They may be happy to do so, or they may suggest another journal that does publish translations. Similarly, with data presented at conferences, it's not unusual to publish an article that's based on content presented at a conference. Just make sure to clearly state that the data and/or an earlier version of that paper was presented at a conference. Now, this does not tend to include extended abstracts that might have a DOI, because most editors don't feel that there's enough new information being added to the article to really require another publication. Preprint servers, lastly, are no longer an issue for most journals. Again, you need to cite the original publication in your paper and let the editor know that a version of the paper can be found in on a preprint server, in an archive, or in a repository, and provide the link. But do take a look at the instructions for authors for journals just to make sure that they do accept preprints. Originality issues are also becoming easier to detect. Most journals use software to measure instances of overlap with previously published work. Most of you will know that if you use someone else's ideas or processes or words, you need to clearly cite them in the paper and provide a full reference to the work. This is true of all content, including websites and blogs, etc. What many are less aware of is the need to cite their own work if you've used it in your paper, because this will show up in an originality check. So if you're engaging with ideas that you have published previously, make sure to cite that previous publication. Now, on the flip side of that, we are seeing a rise of what's called text recycling or salami slicing. You may have heard that term. And this is when you use the same ideas, the same data and/or words excessively to the point that it's not offering any new insights or contributing anything new to the literature or the field. So anything that you publish should be original content and pushing the research field forward in some way. Once you're ready to submit, there are a few steps you should take. It's always a good idea to review what's already been published in the journal that you're planning on submitting to. You might find work that is relevant to your own. And in that case, do reference that work, but only where appropriate. It needs to directly relate to your paper, obviously. Again, you're joining a conversation, an ongoing conversation that's been taking place in that journal. So you want to make sure to thoughtfully engage with that conversation. Make sure that your work matches the aims and scope of the journal. And every journal will have an aims and scope statement. And these statements describe the journal's mission and the type of research they're interested in publishing. And I've included an example up in the upper right-hand corner here. Editors and societies spend a good deal of time crafting these statements so that readers and librarians and authors understand exactly what the journal is about. One of the main reasons manuscripts are rejected is because the research did not fall within the scope of the journal. So you'll find these aims and scope statements on the journal website. Oftentimes it's on the landing page, but if it's not on the landing page, there will be a link to the aims and scope statement on the journal website. You want to take one last review of your bibliography before submitting, just to make sure that you've included everything and that you've removed those references that are no longer in the current draft. And make sure to read and follow the instructions for authors. And I've included a little screenshot in the lower right-hand corner there of the instructions for authors for one of our journals. These are the rule books for the journals. They will provide guidance on how to format your paper, on word counts, and they will always provide information on any relevant charges, whether that be APCs, submission fees, or page charges. And just a quick word about language. I often get this question, should I have my paper language edited before I submit? And when talking with editors, most have said they are happy to look at a paper as long as they can understand the argument and the methods that were used. The language doesn't have to be picture perfect. But do try and have as many of your colleagues as possible read your paper for fluency. And what I would say is find those colleagues that are really critical, that will really take a hard look at your paper and give you critical feedback there. And especially those who do have experience publishing in international journals. However, if you do feel that you need language editing before you submit, many publishers like Taylor and Francis have editing services. You just need to check out the website. It'll usually be within their author services section. When you do submit to a journal, more often than not, you will be submitting to an online system such as ScholarOne or Editorial Manager. So to the right here, you can see the landing page for one of our ScholarOne sites. In this example, someone has begun the submission process. Once you've submitted, you'll be able to follow the progress of your manuscript through the peer review process on the site. I've also included a screenshot of our new submission portal, which most of our open access journals use on the left-hand side of the screen. This is a really intuitive, easy to use submission site linked to both ScholarOne and the Editorial Manager peer review systems. As you can see here, you'll be asked to upload files, in this case, either by dragging or uploading the file from your computer. And once it's uploaded, the files automatically are transferred into the peer review system the journal uses, and the process begins. So before you begin the submission process, take time to familiarize yourself with the system the journal uses and make sure that you understand what's required in terms of documentation and how everything should be formatted. Here are some basic tips to keep in mind prior to submitting, or during the submission process, actually. First of all, as I said, in most cases, you will be submitting to an online system. So make sure that you have all the files on hand that you need to submit. If you're using images or data that's not yours, make sure that you have obtained permission. This is your responsibility, not the publisher's. And once again, to avoid any problems or mistakes, make sure that you have an agreed upon plan with your co-authors on who's responsible for what and which journal you're submitting to. Also be certain that you have their correct information. That would include their preferred spelling of their name, their affiliation, their most relevant email address. Lastly, make sure the version you submit is the final version and not an earlier draft. I know that sounds a bit silly, but it does happen that people submit an earlier draft of their paper and then it's eventually rejected and they realize that it was the wrong version. So take that extra 5 to 10 minutes to make sure all of your files are the most recent files before submitting. We'll now turn to what peer review looks like in practice. And there are 3 types of peer review you're likely to come across. The first is called single blind, and this is when the peer reviewer knows the identity of the author, but the author doesn't know the identity of the peer reviewer. And this is probably the most common type of peer review you'll find within science, technology, and medicine disciplines. The second type, double-blind peer review, is when all identities are hidden. And this is the most common style of peer review within arts and humanities and social sciences. And lastly, we have open peer review. And this is where all identities are known. And there are a lot of different variations of open peer review. So if the journal you're running, you're interested in submitting to has open peer review, make sure to take the time to read about what their process looks like, because sometimes they post things online, including everyone's name and that sort of thing. So you want to make sure that you know what you're getting into before you submit. And here are the main rules involved in the peer review process. The editor will assess the article to see if it's a good fit for the journal in terms of content and quality. They will then select reviewers, though sometimes they'll assign manuscripts to other board members who will then find external reviewers, especially in larger journals where they have a lot of kind of subdisciplines that they're covering. Once the editor receives reports from the reviewers, they'll make a final decision regarding publication. The peer reviewers read and assess the article and any data that's been included. Most journals have 2 to 3 external reviewers assess a manuscript. They'll write a short report with suggested additions and changes for the author and provide a recommendation to the editor regarding publication. Lastly, the journal staff, which is often a part of the publishing house, they're responsible for the systems that are used to run peer review, production, and publication. So they will do an initial technical check of the materials you submit to make sure that the formatting is correct and everything is included in a submission to a journal. They also tend to manage communications between authors, editors, peer reviewers, and they are there to help if there are any technical issues with the peer review platform. So if you're having a difficulty uploading files, that will be the person you're going to be in contact with. So as you can see, there are many different people involved in the peer review process of one article. And here's an overview of how peer review works in most cases. First of all, your manuscript is submitted to a journal and goes through that initial check to see if everything is in order. And if it's not, basically the files will be returned to you with instructions on what you need to do, whether that's reformatting or updating or including more material. And once the files are in order, the submission is then sent to the editor for a quick review. The editor will decide if the paper should be sent out to external peer review at that point in time. So it's important, again, with that introduction, that you really have created a clear picture of what that article is about. At this stage, it can be rejected if it's out of scope of the journal, if it's not complete, if it's unreadable, or if it's not understandable. And this is called a desk reject. Now, if the paper is of interest, the editor will send it out to peer review, usually to 2 or more external reviewers who are specialists in the field. They will read the work and provide a report for the editor with recommendations for a decision. And the most common recommendations are revise and resubmit with major revisions or minor revisions. And even though it can feel a bit like a rejection with the major revisions, this actually means they're interested in your work. So you should celebrate if this is a decision you receive. Your paper can also be rejected at this point, of course. I've also included accept, but with a star next to it. It is possible that your paper will be accepted without revisions, but it's highly unlikely. And here I always tell the story of Eugene Fama, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics a few years ago. And I was fortunate enough to be able to go listen to the lecture that he gave about the research that led him to win the Nobel Prize. And as he was presenting one of the papers that led him to win the Nobel Prize, he stood back and looked at it and he said, I think this is one of the only papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So here's a man in his 70s presenting a paper that led him to win the Nobel Prize, and it's one of the few papers that was ever accepted without revisions. So that's just to say every piece of writing can be improved. So you should expect that this is going to be the most common decision that you will receive. Now, once you make the revisions, you will resubmit your revisions to the editor, who will either accept it or they may send it out again to those reviewers to see if they're happy or if they have further comments. Now, here's the bad news. Your paper can go through this process a couple of times and still be rejected. I'll tell you how to avoid that in just a moment. Just thought I'd quickly show you a kind of emergent form of peer review that we're seeing. Many publishers and journals have introduced what's called cascading peer review. Cascading peer review is when the journal that an author submits to rejects the manuscript, but suggests another journal that would possibly be a better fit. The author is given the option and can agree to the transfer or not. This can happen at two stages of the process. Here you see that after the DES reject, the author is given the opportunity to transfer to another journal. So that's usually because it doesn't fit the aims and scope of that journal. It can also happen after the manuscript has been sent out for external peer review. They may suggest rejecting the article, but still think it's sound science, just not a good fit for that particular journal. At this point, the author will be given the option of transferring the submission to another journal. In some cases, the peer review reports can be transferred along with the manuscript. And in those cases, the editor may look at the manuscript and the initial reports and make a decision right away, or they may end up by sending it out to external peer review again. The goal behind cascading and transfers is to offer a greater service to authors and to make the peer review system even more efficient. But again, it's always the author's choice. Now, I mentioned that you can have your article go through the peer review process a couple times and still be rejected. And here's just a few tips to keep in mind to help you avoid that process and just deal with the peer review process in general. And the first tip here is don't become disheartened with the process, especially when you get that revise and resubmit with major revisions. As I said, it can feel a bit like a rejection. And if you are feeling a bit down after that, I suggest just shut down the computer and forget about it for a couple days. And when you're ready to get back to work, open up the computer and carefully read the letter that the editor sent along with the reviewer's comments. Oftentimes they'll give you some guidance on how to deal with the reviewer's comments, especially if the reviewers are giving conflicting guidance. And they will give you some guidance on when your revisions are due back. So they'll give you some deadlines and such. If you have co-authors, make sure to set up a meeting early on with them, send them all the materials, the editor letter and the reviewer reports. And then when you get together, go through those reviewer comments and make a to-do list. So take every single recommendation that they've made, that they've suggested, and create a list with each of those recommendations. And you might break them down into categories and work through them and decide what amendments you want to make based on their suggestions and make those amendments. But what I would really recommend is that you address every comment, even if you are choosing not to make the change that they're recommending. So where you have amended, make sure to include specifically where you made that change and what material you have taken away or added. And if you chose to disregard one of the recommendations, you still need to address this. So be specific and make sure to be respectful. in addressing that. So if, for example, if they would like to see you cite an author that you didn't cite in your paper, but you feel that that is not appropriate for what you're trying to achieve with your paper, you just need to let the editor know why that was. So again, be specific in terms of your feedback there. And when you are getting ready to send back your comments and your revisions, make sure to review your response to the editor a couple times just to make sure that it's clear, number one, and that there isn't any remnants of frustration you might have felt during the process, so that it's very professional and respectful. You know, this is your community, so you do need to be professional and respectful of both the reviewers and the editors, because you will likely resubmit to the journal in the future. You may end up by being a reviewer for that journal and possibly end up by joining the editorial board. So again, this is your community. You want to be respectful of it. And just remember throughout the process, irrespective of how frustrated you get, people are just trying, the reviewers and the editor, just trying to help you publish your very best work. They're helping, you know, to hoping to help you to improve your manuscript. And here's some reasons for rejection that we've pulled together from editors' comments to us. The first one is sent to a wrong journal. And this comes back to remembering to carefully read the aims and scope of the journal and to look at what's been previously published in the journal to make sure that your current piece of writing will fit. You want to understand what sort of writing project you're undertaking and research the best platform for your work to help you avoid number 2. In terms of number 3, this one is actually quite simple. It's just about reviewing and following the instructions for authors. They're always going to give you a word count. So you want to make sure that you follow their guidance on the different types of content and how long they would like those different versions to be. Now, 4 through 9, this is really about sharing your work and getting as much feedback as you can throughout the process. Have as many trusted colleagues read and comment on your work. And as I said earlier, find those colleagues that are really critical, not the ones that are going to be really nice to you and say, oh, great work. You want the ones that are actually going to kind of pull your paper apart and identify those areas where you could be clear, where you could bolster your argument. And for those of you that are non-English speakers, if you're publishing in English, try and have a native English speaker take a look at your manuscript, or someone at least who is very adept and has published a lot in English. And if you are publishing in an international journal, but your paper is about some very specific local examples, you just want to make sure that you consider having counterexamples or think about the theoretical framework or methods section that you're using to make sure that there will be interest to an international audience. And lastly, think about presenting your work, if you can, I know it's quite challenging now, at conferences, whether they're online conferences or in-person conferences, as much as possible. Again, it gets you outside of your bubble and has allows you to have people that you normally wouldn't come into contact with able to listen to your work and give you feedback on it. And the last one, libelous, unethical, rude, and lack subjectivity, obviously avoid at all costs. So what do you do when your article is accepted? Well, first of all, celebrate. You've earned it. While getting published is a great accomplishment the first time, no matter what stage of the career, it's always a great achievement. Make sure to keep both the original manuscript you submitted and the accepted manuscript. So think back to those versions I talked about at the very beginning of this presentation. If you didn't publish in an open access journal, it's especially important that you keep all of these different versions. As said, you may post the the accepted manuscript in an institutional repository after an embargo period if you've published in a subscription-based journal or directly on your website. And publishers try their very best to move manuscripts through the production process as quickly as possible, but much depends on the author. So be sure to return proofs by the suggested deadline and answer any queries that the production editor might have as quickly as possible. And if any part of this process is confusing, don't hesitate to ask questions. That's what we're here for. Each publisher uses slightly different systems and might have slightly different processes. So it's no surprise that you might be confused. So again, don't be shy about asking for clarification. And lastly, here are some simple but effective ways of drawing attention to your work. And the first one takes absolutely no time at all. It's about using your email signature. So underneath your address and your contact information, you can just add a line with a link to your article. And maybe you have one kind of descriptive sentence about what the article is about. You're likely writing to people in your network, so they'll be interested to see what you've recently published. If you have a profile page on your institution's website or a personal web page or sites for any projects you're involved with, make sure to include a link to your article there as well. Again, I think it's helpful to have 1 or 2 lines describing what the article is about, just to pique people's curiosity. But what's important to remember is the more links there are to your article from a range of websites, the higher it will appear in search engine results. So when people are searching for a topic, it's the more links to it, the higher up in that results list it will fall. And lastly, if you're on any social networking sites or professional networking sites or discussion lists, then do make the most of those. Post a short message to any listservs you're a member of, letting people know that you've recently published and including that link to your publication. The same with, social media. I have a friend on Facebook who's really great. Every time he's got a publication, he'll say, "This may be of interest to some." And everyone knows what kind of research he does. So those people that are interested will click through to it. And don't forget about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is really emerging as a great site for sharing research. So do consider creating a nice profile there for sharing and engaging with your research community. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
We are really glad to have you with us, Victoria, and we wish that we'll be able to do similar webinars in the future and count on all the audience from different parts of the world to join with us again. Having said that, I think that is it from our side, and we'll stay in touch, and we'll keep you informed about the PowerPoint and the recording. Thank you very much, and have a nice day. And thank you once again, Victoria, for your time.
Thanks for having me.